The mystery surrounding the Philistines has captivated historians, archaeologists, and even the general public for centuries. A group whose name is often tied to ancient enemies and biblical stories, they have long been known in the modern world, yet so much of their existence remains shrouded in darkness. Why, then, do we know so little about one of the most significant cultures of the ancient Near East? The Philistines are typically remembered for their famous biblical encounters, chief among them, the legendary battle between David and Goliath. But beyond these dramatic episodes, the Philistines seem to fade into the background of ancient history, their identity overshadowed by those who chronicled their interactions with them, the Israelites, the Egyptians, the Assyrians. The history of their rise, their cities, their culture, and their eventual downfall remains fragmented. Their cities have long since crumbled into the earth, their artifacts scattered and buried beneath centuries of dust. But what remains in the silence of these ruins? What can the bones of their cities and the remnants of their pottery, their weapons, and their temples tell us about a people who were so much more than the villainous figures that have been imprinted into our collective memory? This story is not merely about the Philistines as an ancient enemy to the Israelites or as a footnote in the pages of ancient history. This is a story about a people whose lives were shaped by forces far greater than themselves, forces of migration, cultural exchange, and imperial domination. It is about a people who found themselves at the crossroads of empires, struggling to preserve their identity amidst the pressures of foreign rule and changing political landscapes. It is a story of survival, innovation, and cultural fusion, one that takes us deep into the heart of the ancient world, to the very coastal cities they once inhabited and the remnants they left behind. The enigma of the Philistines begins with their very arrival in the Levant. Were they the sea peoples described in Egyptian texts, a mysterious seafaring group of marauders who invaded Egypt's territories and wreaked havoc across the eastern Mediterranean during the Bronze Age collapse? Or were they simply one of many groups of migrants searching for new opportunities in a world that had been shattered by the upheaval of the Late Bronze Age? Archaeological evidence suggests that the Philistines were part of this larger wave of migration that swept through the Mediterranean, and it is in their material culture that we can begin to trace their roots. Though many of the details about their origins remain unclear, what is evident is that they came from a different world, from the Aegean, or possibly from Anatolia, areas rich with maritime trade and intricate craftsmanship. Arriving on the shores of the Levant around 1200 BCE, the Philistines settled in 5 key cities along the coastal plains: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. These cities would become the heart of Philistine power, thriving on the resources of the sea and the land, and becoming centers of trade and commerce. But while the cities flourished, the Philistines were not without enemies. The already established Canaanite populations in the area did not welcome these foreign settlers with open arms. Early Philistine interactions with the local Canaanites were marked by tension and, at times, violent conflict. However, the Philistines did not simply come to conquer. They came to integrate, to merge their culture with that of the people they encountered. This process of cultural fusion, through trade, marriage, and shared labor, gave rise to a complex society that combined elements from both the Aegean and the Canaanite worlds. This blending of cultures is most apparent in the Philistine material culture. Excavations have revealed pottery that blends the familiar shapes of the Aegean with the techniques of the Canaanite potters. Philistine architecture, too, shows a blend of these two worlds, with their cities built using methods borrowed from both their Aegean ancestors and the local traditions they encountered. But it is not just in their artifacts that we see this fusion, it is also in their way of life. The Philistines were masters of coastal trade, their cities serving as hubs for merchants traveling along the Mediterranean. They were also known for their skill in metalworking, particularly with iron, which gave them an edge in warfare and contributed to their rise as a dominant power in the region. Yet, despite these achievements, the Philistines remained outsiders. While they were able to carve out their own independent society, they were constantly under the shadow of larger, more powerful empires. The Egyptians, whose presence loomed large in the region, viewed the Philistines as a threat. Pharaoh Ramses III recorded in his annals that he fought against the Sea Peoples, describing them as a people who came from the islands of the sea. This description has long been debated, but the fact that the Egyptians acknowledged the Philistines as a distinct group shows that, even in the eyes of the mighty Egyptian empire, the Philistines were not just a scattered group of invaders, they were a people with their own identity, one that demanded recognition. But the Philistines' relationship with the Egyptians was not purely adversarial. At times, they were allies, entering into treaties that ensured mutual protection and trade. These shifting alliances, however, were not enough to shield the Philistines from the rising power of the Assyrian Empire. By the 8th century BCE, the Assyrians, under kings like Tiglath-Pileser III and Sennacherib, began to dominate the region, and the Philistine cities found themselves caught between the ambitions of the Assyrians and the needs of their own people. The Assyrians demanded tribute from the Philistines, and in exchange, the Philistine cities enjoyed a degree of autonomy, though this autonomy was never without a price. The Philistines, despite their military might and cultural resilience, could not resist the encroaching tide of empire forever. It is at this point in history, when the Philistines were at the height of their power and influence, that we encounter the most famous of their biblical portrayals. The tale of David and Goliath is, in many ways, the quintessential story of the clash between the Philistines and the Israelites. But the Philistines were far more than mere adversaries to the Israelites. They were a proud people, their warriors unmatched in skill, their cities teeming with the riches of the Mediterranean world. The story of David's victory over Goliath is a story of underdog triumph, but it is also the story of two worlds colliding, of a small, emerging kingdom standing up to a long-established and powerful culture. Despite their losses in battle, despite their eventual defeat by the Babylonians, the Philistine story is not one of complete annihilation. The legacy they left behind is far more complex than their role as enemies of Israel or pawns in the larger geopolitical struggles of the ancient world. In fact, the Philistines' greatest contribution to the ancient world may be their resilience, their ability to adapt to new circumstances while retaining the core elements of their identity. Their cities, their art, their trade networks, and their distinctive culture all played a role in shaping the history of the Eastern Mediterranean long after the last of their cities had fallen to foreign powers. And so, as we stand among the ruins of the Philistine cities today, we are faced with a profound mystery. What remains of the Philistines is not merely a story of war and conquest, but a story of cultural fusion, resilience, and survival. The Philistines were not simply the enemies of the Israelites, nor were they simply invaders from across the sea. They were a people who lived, loved, fought, and built a civilization in one of the most tumultuous periods of ancient history. And in that story, buried deep beneath the sands of time, there is still so much left to discover. The truth of the Philistines, who they were, how they lived, and what they left behind, remains to be uncovered. And in the search for that truth, we come to understand not only the Philistines, but also the complexities of the ancient world itself. The end of the Bronze Age, around 1200 BCE, was a time of extraordinary upheaval and transformation in the ancient world. Empires crumbled, trade routes were disrupted, and entire civilizations disappeared or were forced to adapt in order to survive. This was a period defined by chaos, a time when the stability that had once been the hallmark of the ancient Mediterranean world was shattered, and new powers and peoples began to emerge from the ashes of the old. Among these new arrivals were the Philistines, a people whose origins remain a subject of debate, but whose impact on the region was undeniable. To understand the Philistines, we must first understand the collapse that set the stage for their arrival. The Late Bronze Age was a time of relative peace and prosperity for much of the eastern Mediterranean. Great empires like Egypt, the Hittites, and the Mycenaeans ruled over vast territories, maintaining complex networks of trade and diplomacy. These empires, with their grand cities and sophisticated cultures, seemed as though they would endure for centuries to come. But the stability of the Bronze Age world was fragile, and by the end of the 12th century BCE, it began to unravel in dramatic fashion. One of the key events of this collapse was the destruction of several major cities in the eastern Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence shows that many cities were burned to the ground, their ruins abandoned and left to be reclaimed by nature. The reasons for this widespread destruction are complex and multifaceted. Climate change, famine, invasions, and internal rebellions all played a role in the disintegration of the old order. But there is one particular factor that stands out above the rest: the arrival of the so-called Sea Peoples. The Sea Peoples were a confederation of various maritime groups, whose origins remain shrouded in mystery. They appeared suddenly and without warning on the shores of the eastern Mediterranean, attacking cities and empires with unprecedented ferocity. The Egyptians, who faced their own battles with the Sea Peoples, recorded these invasions in their texts, describing them as marauders who came from the islands of the sea. The exact identity of these invaders remains uncertain, but it is clear that the Philistines were among them. They were part of the wave of destruction that swept across the Mediterranean world, contributing to the collapse of the Great Bronze Age civilizations. As the Sea Peoples moved from one city to the next, they left behind a trail of devastation. In some cases, entire cities were wiped out, their populations either killed or forced to flee. But not all of the Sea Peoples were bent on destruction. Some settled in the lands they conquered, carving out new homes in foreign territories. This was the fate of the Philistines. Rather than merely pillaging the coastal cities of the Levant, they took up residence there, establishing their own communities along the fertile coastline of what is now modern-day Israel and the Gaza Strip. These new settlers, who would later be known as the Philistines, brought with them a culture that was markedly different from that of the indigenous Canaanites. The Philistines settled in 5 main cities: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. These cities would become the heart of Philistine power in the region, centers of trade, culture, and military might. The Philistine settlement in the Levant was not an isolated event. It was part of a larger wave of migration that affected much of the ancient world at this time. As the great empires of the Bronze Age collapsed, new groups of people sought to fill the power vacuum that was left behind. The Philistines were just one of many such groups, but they would come to play a particularly important role in the history of the Eastern Mediterranean. In the early years of their settlement, the Philistines faced significant challenges. The Canaanites, who had lived in the region for centuries, were not willing to simply accept these new settlers. There were conflicts and skirmishes as the Philistines fought to establish their foothold in the region. But over time, the Philistines managed to carve out a place for themselves. Their cities grew and prospered, fueled by trade, agriculture, and the resources of the sea. They became a distinct people, with their own culture, language, and customs, yet they were also influenced by the cultures around them. The Philistine settlement of the Levant was marked by a process of cultural blending. As the Philistines interacted with the local Canaanites, they adopted many of their customs and practices, while also introducing their own unique traditions. One of the most significant aspects of Philistine culture was their mastery of ironworking. The Philistines were among the first people in the ancient Near East to make extensive use of iron, a material that would eventually revolutionize warfare and technology. Their mastery of iron gave them a significant advantage in battle, allowing them to create weapons and tools that were stronger and more durable than those made from bronze. In addition to their technological innovations, the Philistines also brought with them a distinct style of architecture and pottery. The Philistine cities were characterized by their impressive fortifications, which included massive city walls and gates. These structures were designed to protect the cities from external threats, including the neighboring Egyptians and the expanding empires of Assyria and Babylon. The Philistines also developed a distinctive style of pottery, which was influenced by both their Aegean origins and the local Canaanite traditions. This pottery, with its intricate designs and shapes, became one of the defining features of Philistine material culture. But while the Philistines were making their mark on the Levant, the region around them was undergoing dramatic changes. The Egyptians, once the dominant power in the area, were struggling to maintain control over their territories. The once great Hittite Empire had crumbled, leaving a vacuum of power in Anatolia and Syria. And to the north, the Assyrians were beginning to emerge as a dominant force in the ancient world. As these new empires rose to power, the Philistines found themselves caught in the middle, forced to navigate a complex web of alliances, conflicts, and shifting allegiances. The Egyptians, for example, were not content to let the Philistines establish themselves as an independent power. Pharaoh Ramses III, in his inscriptions, records his battles against the Sea Peoples, including the Philistines, describing them as a threat to Egyptian dominance in the region. The Egyptians fought back fiercely, but the Philistines, with their strong fortifications and military prowess, managed to resist Egyptian attempts at domination. At the same time, the Philistines sought to establish their own power base, striking alliances with other peoples in the region, including the Canaanites and the Israelites. This period of conflict and negotiation laid the groundwork for the Philistines' future interactions with the Israelites. The Philistines, who had once been outsiders to the region, began to emerge as one of the dominant forces in the Levant, their influence felt from the Mediterranean coast to the hills of Judah. But the story of the Philistines would not be one of unchallenged success. As their cities grew in power and wealth, they attracted the attention of their neighbors, who saw the Philistines as both rivals and enemies. The Israelites, whose kingdom was emerging just to the north of the Philistine cities, would eventually become one of the Philistines' most persistent rivals. The biblical accounts of their battles, most famously the story of David and Goliath, would cast the Philistines as the archetypal enemies of the Israelites. But beneath this biblical narrative lies a more complex reality, a story of two peoples, each struggling for survival and identity in a world that was rapidly changing. By the end of the 13th century BCE, the Philistines had become a significant power in their own right. They were no longer just a group of refugees from the collapse of the Bronze Age world. They had established a thriving civilization, with their own cities, armies, and culture. And yet, despite their successes, they were still deeply vulnerable to the shifting tides of imperial power that characterized the ancient Near East. Their cities, their people, and their way of life would soon be tested by the rising forces of Assyria, Babylon, and Egypt, marking the beginning of a new chapter in their history, one that would ultimately lead to their decline. The story of the Philistines' arrival in the Levant, therefore, is not just the story of one group of people settling in a new land. It is the story of a world in transition, a world where old empires were falling and new powers were emerging. It is the story of a people who, like so many others, were caught between cultures, empires, and identities in a time of great upheaval. And in this tumultuous period of history, the Philistines were both participants in and products of the great collapse that reshaped the ancient Mediterranean world. The origins of the Philistines have been a subject of fascination and debate for centuries. Despite being one of the most significant groups of the ancient Near East, their true identity remains an enigma, obscured by myth, historical ambiguity, and limited archaeological evidence. Most of what we know about the Philistines comes from the writings of their contemporaries, particularly the Israelites, Egyptians, and other neighboring peoples who viewed them through the lens of conflict and competition. These external accounts, while invaluable, often present a one-dimensional view of the Philistines, framing them primarily as enemies or rivals. But who were the Philistines beyond the context of warfare and biblical narrative? What do the archaeological remains, the artifacts, and the cities they left behind reveal about their true origins? The most widely accepted theory is that the Philistines originated from the Aegean world, an area that includes the Greek islands and the coastal regions of Anatolia. This theory is supported by the striking similarities between Philistine material culture and that of the Aegean peoples, particularly in the styles of pottery, weapons, and architecture. The Philistines, it seems, were not simply a group of invaders who swept in from an unknown land. Rather, they were part of a larger wave of migration that affected the entire eastern Mediterranean during the collapse of the Bronze Age. This period, roughly from 1200 BCE, was marked by the fall of several major empires, including the Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittites, and the Egyptians. It was a time of upheaval and societal collapse that led to the creation of new, often transient, groups across the region, groups like the Philistines. The exact nature of their migration is still a subject of debate. Some scholars suggest that the Philistines were part of the broader Sea Peoples, a confederation of various maritime groups described in Egyptian records. These Sea Peoples, whom the Egyptians depicted as marauding invaders from the islands of the sea, are thought to have caused widespread destruction across the eastern Mediterranean. According to Egyptian records, Pharaoh Ramses III fought several battles against these invaders, describing them as a significant threat to his empire. The Philistines were likely among these groups, though their precise origins remain unclear. The Sea Peoples are often depicted as a loose confederation of various peoples who came from different parts of the Aegean and Anatolian coasts. It is possible that the Philistines were originally part of this group, later settling in the Levant after the collapse of the Hittite Empire and the disintegration of the Mycenaean civilization. Archaeological evidence offers clues to their origins. The pottery found in Philistine settlements, for example, bears a striking resemblance to the designs and styles common in the Aegean and Anatolia. The distinctive Philistine bichrome pottery, characterized by bold geometric patterns and dark red coloring, is one of the most well-known features of their material culture. These potteries, along with other artifacts such as weapons and tools, suggest that the Philistines were not just passive settlers but active participants in the exchange of ideas, goods, and cultural practices between the Aegean world and the Levant. Their arrival in the region was not merely a result of war or conquest, but part of a larger process of migration, interaction, and integration with the existing cultures of the area. The Philistine settlement in the Levant was not a simple matter of displacement. Instead, it was a process of adaptation and fusion. As they settled along the coastal cities of what is now modern-day Israel and the Gaza Strip, the Philistines began to adopt and adapt many aspects of the Canaanite culture. The Canaanites had been the dominant population in the region for centuries, and their influence on the Philistines was inevitable. Over time, the Philistines incorporated Canaanite religious practices, architectural styles, and social structures into their own way of life. Yet, despite these influences, the Philistines managed to retain their distinct cultural identity. This ability to blend the old with the new, integrating foreign elements while maintaining their own traditions, became a defining feature of Philistine society. This cultural fusion can be seen in the urban planning and architecture of Philistine cities. The five principal cities, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath, each had a unique character, shaped by both their Aegean heritage and their interactions with the Canaanites. These cities were built with impressive fortifications, often incorporating defensive features like massive city walls, gates, and towers. Some of these architectural styles appear to have been influenced by Aegean building techniques, particularly the use of ashlar masonry, a method of constructing walls using large, precisely cut stones. However, the cities also contained elements typical of Canaanite architecture, such as open courtyards and smaller, more intimate spaces for residential living. The blending of Aegean and Canaanite elements is most apparent in the religious practices of the Philistines. The Philistine pantheon was centered around the worship of Dagon, a god whose origins are believed to trace back to the ancient Semitic peoples of the Levant, yet whose iconography bore strong similarities to the gods of the Aegean world. The worship of Dagon, depicted as a fish god or grain deity, was particularly prominent in the Philistine city of Gaza. Archaeological findings suggest that Dagon was a central figure in Philistine religious rituals, and his temples were some of the most significant religious sites in Philistine cities. The Philistine religious practices were also heavily influenced by Canaanite traditions, with many similarities to the rituals of other Levantine cultures. However, the Philistines also brought their own unique customs and practices, creating a distinct religious identity that combined elements of both their Aegean and Canaanite heritages. Language is another key aspect of Philistine identity, though it remains one of the most elusive. While the Philistines are often associated with the Aegean world, there is evidence to suggest that their language was not entirely Greek or Anatolian, but a distinct dialect that was influenced by both the Aegean languages and the local Semitic tongues of the Levant. The Philistines were, after all, living in close proximity to the Canaanites and other Semitic-speaking peoples, and their language likely reflected this interaction. Some scholars suggest that the Philistine language may have been an early form of Indo-European, influenced by Greek or Anatolian languages, but incorporating many Semitic elements from the surrounding region. Despite the integration of Canaanite culture, the Philistines' Aegean roots were never fully erased. This was particularly true in their military practices and in their use of technology. The Philistines were among the first peoples in the region to extensively use iron, a material that gave them a significant advantage in warfare. Iron weapons, such as swords, spears, and shields, became central to the Philistine military, and their expertise in metallurgy was a key factor in their rise as a dominant force in the region. The Philistines' ironworking skills were part of a larger technological revolution that was sweeping through the ancient Near East at the time, marking the beginning of the Iron Age. The evidence for the Philistines' Aegean origins is not limited to material culture. Ancient texts, including Egyptian inscriptions, also refer to the arrival of the Sea Peoples, a group of seafaring invaders who brought great destruction to the eastern Mediterranean. The Egyptians, in particular, recorded the battle between Pharaoh Ramses III and the Sea Peoples in great detail, describing how they fought against various groups, including the Philistines, who were identified as one of the primary factions. The fact that the Egyptians recognized the Philistines as a distinct people, separate from the other Sea Peoples, provides further evidence of their unique origins and identity. However, the Egyptians' portrayal of the Philistines as fierce invaders also highlights the tension and conflict that characterized their relationships with neighboring peoples. The Philistines' Aegean origins are also supported by the evidence of their settlement patterns. Their cities along the Levantine coast were strategically positioned for trade and military control, and their coastal locations suggest that they had a strong maritime culture. The Philistines were skilled sailors and traders, and their cities became important centers of commerce in the Mediterranean world. Their connection to the broader Mediterranean trade network allowed them to acquire goods from across the region, including metals, textiles, and luxury items, which further enriched their culture. Through the lens of archaeology, the Philistines come into clearer view as more than just the biblical enemies of Israel. They were a people born from the destruction of the Bronze Age, shaped by the migrations, invasions, and cultural exchanges of their time. Their story is one of adaptation, survival, and resilience, one that transcends the simplistic image of invaders and enemies, revealing a people who were deeply connected to the ancient Mediterranean world and whose legacy is still felt today. The Philistines were not just a footnote in history, they were a pivotal part of a world in transition, a world whose complexities and mysteries continue to unfold. The arrival of the Philistines in the coastal plains of the Levant did not occur in isolation. They entered a world already populated by the Canaanites, a people with centuries of history, established cities, and deeply rooted cultural traditions. The interaction between the newcomers and the existing populations was complex, a mixture of conflict, adaptation, and cultural exchange. It was a delicate balance between survival and dominance, a negotiation of identity in a land where every settlement, every piece of arable land, and every trade route had its own value. The story of the early interactions between the Philistines and the Canaanites provides a window into the human experience of migration, the struggle for resources, and the forging of new societies amidst the shifting sands of history. The initial encounters between the Philistines and the Canaanites were inevitably marked by tension. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Philistines arrived in relatively large groups, bringing with them new technologies, military techniques, and cultural practices. Their presence challenged the existing balance of power along the coast. The Canaanites, whose cities had stood for centuries and whose trade networks were well established, could not simply ignore these newcomers. Conflicts arose over territory, access to the sea, and control over trade routes. In some cases, these confrontations escalated into violent clashes, leaving behind layers of destruction that archaeologists today interpret as evidence of early Philistine-Canaanite conflicts. Yet these moments of violence were only part of the story, the interactions were not purely antagonistic. As the Philistines settled into the region, they began to adopt certain aspects of Canaanite life. This process of cultural exchange was gradual and subtle, visible in everyday artifacts, architecture, and religious practices. For example, while the Philistines retained certain Aegean architectural features in their cities, such as ashlar masonry and specific city layouts, they also incorporated elements common to Canaanite settlements, like open courtyards and specific urban planning techniques. This blending of styles illustrates a pragmatic approach. The Philistines were outsiders, but they were learning to navigate and integrate into a world that had its own established norms. The architecture of their cities became a physical manifestation of cultural fusion, a statement that they were neither fully foreign nor entirely indigenous. Trade played a crucial role in the relationship between the Philistines and the Canaanites. The coastal cities were naturally positioned to engage in maritime commerce, linking the Levant with the broader Mediterranean world. The Philistines, with their Aegean roots, were already familiar with maritime trade and had skills that complemented the local economy. Their arrival introduced new goods, new techniques, and new commercial opportunities to the region. Pottery, textiles, and metals moved along these trade routes, and the exchange of goods often facilitated the exchange of ideas, beliefs, and customs. Over time, trade became both a practical necessity and a tool of diplomacy, softening the edges of cultural conflict and fostering a sense of interdependence between the two peoples. Religion also played a significant role in shaping interactions. The Canaanites had long established religious traditions, with temples, shrines, and rituals embedded in the social fabric of their communities. The Philistines, while introducing their own deities and ritual practices, most notably the worship of Dagon, also engaged with local religious practices. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Philistines may have incorporated certain Canaanite rituals and symbols into their own worship, creating a hybrid religious identity that reflected both their heritage and their new environment. Religion, therefore, became another avenue for negotiation and adaptation, a means through which the Philistines could claim legitimacy and establish a sense of belonging in a land that was not originally theirs. The tension between conflict and cooperation is also evident in the social structure of the Philistine settlements. The five principal cities, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath, functioned as independent city-states, each with its own governing elite, economic focus, and social hierarchy. These cities were fortified, indicating a continued awareness of external threats, whether from Canaanites or other emerging powers in the region. Within the cities, however, there is evidence of interaction and integration with local populations. Burial practices, household artifacts, and the layout of urban neighborhoods suggest that over time, the Philistines and Canaanites developed a level of coexistence, though always tempered by the need to protect resources and assert dominance. Conflict, however, remained a persistent undercurrent. The biblical narrative often emphasizes the adversarial relationship between the Philistines and their neighbors, portraying the Philistines as aggressors in the struggles for territory and power. While these accounts are colored by the perspective of the Israelites and other chroniclers, they are not entirely divorced from historical reality. Skirmishes, raids, and battles were a part of everyday life in the region, as each group sought to protect its interests and expand its influence. Yet, even in these moments of conflict, there is evidence of negotiation, diplomacy, and pragmatic alliances. The Philistines, like any people seeking survival, were not purely destructive, they were also skilled at adapting to the circumstances around them, finding ways to coexist, trade, and sometimes even collaborate with those they initially encountered as rivals. The Philistines' ability to adapt is also visible in their material culture. The blending of Aegean and Canaanite pottery styles, for instance, demonstrates a willingness to adopt local techniques while retaining elements of their ancestral heritage. The distinctive bichrome pottery, with its intricate designs, reflects both the artistic traditions of their homeland and the influence of Canaanite artisans. Similarly, their metalworking and weaponry show a fusion of foreign innovation with local techniques. The Philistines were not simply passive recipients of local culture, they actively transformed it, integrating their knowledge and skills in ways that enriched both their own society and that of their neighbors. Over time, the Philistines established themselves as a formidable presence along the coastal plains. Their cities became centers of economic, military, and cultural influence, projecting power across the region. Yet, the story of their early interactions with the Canaanites is a reminder that identity is never fixed, it is negotiated, contested, and constantly evolving. The Philistines were shaped by the people they encountered, just as they shaped the world around them. Their rise was not simply the story of conquest, but of integration, adaptation, and the creation of a new society that combined the old with the new, the familiar with the foreign. The early period of Philistine-Canaanite interaction sets the stage for the complex dynamics that would characterize the region for centuries to come. The Philistines' ability to balance conflict with cooperation, to adopt and adapt, to protect their interests while engaging with local traditions, reflects a sophisticated understanding of human society and survival. It also foreshadows the challenges they would face in the centuries ahead, as larger empires, the Egyptians, Assyrians, and Babylonians, began to exert influence over the region. The Philistines were not simply a footnote in history, they were active participants in the creation of a dynamic, interconnected world, negotiating their place amidst shifting powers and competing cultures. In examining the relationship between the Philistines and the Canaanites, we see the broader patterns of human migration and cultural interaction. It is a story of adaptation, resilience, and the forging of identity in a new environment. The Philistines arrived as outsiders, but through a combination of force, diplomacy, and cultural engagement, they established themselves as a distinct and influential people. Their story reminds us that the creation of culture is never linear or simple, it is the product of conflict, exchange, and the constant negotiation of identity in a world where survival depends as much on understanding others as on asserting oneself. In this early chapter of their history, the Philistines began to define who they were, not just as a people of the sea, but as a people who could navigate the complex realities of life in a land that was at once foreign and home. The rise of the Philistine cities along the coastal plains of the Levant marked a significant transformation in the political and cultural landscape of the ancient world. From their initial settlement in the region, the Philistines steadily developed into a dominant force, crafting a unique civilization that was deeply influenced by their Aegean origins yet intricately woven into the fabric of the local Canaanite world. Their cities, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath, emerged as powerful centers of trade, culture, and military strength, playing a central role in the shifting dynamics of the eastern Mediterranean. In understanding the rise of these cities, one must consider not only the external pressures they faced but also the internal innovations that allowed them to thrive in an environment filled with competing powers and changing alliances. The Philistines were not merely settlers in a foreign land, they were ambitious conquerors, artisans, and traders who quickly adapted to their new environment and made it their own. Their cities were built with the deliberate intention of creating fortified strongholds, signaling a people who were prepared for both internal and external conflict. The defensive features of Philistine cities are among the most striking aspects of their archaeological remains. Massive city walls, fortified gates, and strategically placed towers were not just symbolic of their power, they were practical responses to the tumultuous world in which they lived. The Philistines, who had once arrived as migrants, now sought to consolidate their position in a region that was anything but peaceful. Their cities became the beating heart of a civilization that balanced cultural assimilation with fierce independence. These cities were not isolated fortresses but interconnected hubs of trade and commerce. The Philistines, with their mastery of maritime navigation and trade, exploited their coastal location to establish thriving economic centers. The Mediterranean, with its extensive network of trade routes, became the lifeblood of Philistine prosperity. Goods from Egypt, Anatolia, Cyprus, and even farther afield passed through Philistine hands. The cities of Ashkelon and Gaza, in particular, became important ports, facilitating the exchange of metals, textiles, and pottery. The Philistine involvement in this vast economic network allowed them not only to accumulate wealth but also to acquire new technologies, artistic styles, and cultural practices, which they seamlessly incorporated into their own society. One of the most notable contributions of the Philistines to the ancient world was their technological innovation, particularly in metallurgy. While the region had been using bronze for centuries, the Philistines were among the first to adopt and refine the use of iron. This gave them a distinct military advantage, allowing them to forge weapons and tools that were stronger and more durable than those made of bronze. The introduction of iron weaponry, swords, spears, and shields, changed the course of warfare in the region. The Philistines' ability to produce and wield iron with such proficiency made them a formidable force, both in defending their cities and in engaging in military campaigns beyond their borders. The importance of ironworking to Philistine society cannot be overstated. Iron weapons not only enhanced the Philistine military but also allowed them to engage more effectively with neighboring powers. The ability to forge iron swords and spears gave the Philistines an edge in battle, making their armies more formidable than those of their rivals. Additionally, ironworking was a key aspect of the Philistine economy. The extraction of iron ore, the smelting process, and the crafting of weapons and tools all required a high degree of skill and organization. This technological innovation contributed to the creation of a strong and sustainable economy, providing the Philistines with both the means to defend themselves and the resources to maintain their cities. Beyond military technology, the Philistines also made significant contributions to the cultural and artistic heritage of the region. The material culture of the Philistines, particularly their pottery and architecture, reflects a blend of Aegean and Canaanite influences. Philistine pottery, for example, is characterized by its distinctive bichrome style, decorated with bold geometric patterns in dark red and black. These designs, which were unlike anything seen in Canaanite pottery, suggest a deliberate effort on the part of the Philistines to maintain a unique cultural identity. The pottery is not merely functional, it is also a form of artistic expression, a way for the Philistines to assert their presence in a land filled with established cultures. The architecture of Philistine cities, too, reveals much about their ambitions. The use of ashlar masonry, a technique associated with the Aegean world, stands out in the construction of their fortifications and public buildings. The Philistines were masters of both defensive architecture and urban planning. Their cities were laid out with careful attention to accessibility, defense, and commerce. Large, central courtyards often served as focal points, while narrow streets wound through the residential and commercial districts. This urban layout, combined with the impressive defensive walls, created cities that were not only strategically sound but also vibrant centers of civic life. Religion, too, played a central role in the development of Philistine society. The Philistines brought with them their own pantheon of gods, the most prominent of which was Dagon, a deity associated with the sea and grain. Dagon's temples, particularly those at Gaza and Ashdod, were important religious and cultural centers, where rituals and offerings were made to ensure prosperity and protection for the city. These temples were often built in grand styles, featuring massive courtyards, altars, and statues, reflecting the importance of religion in Philistine daily life. The worship of Dagon, however, was not the only religious practice in Philistine society. As they interacted with their Canaanite neighbors, the Philistines incorporated many aspects of Canaanite religious practices into their own worship. This syncretism is evident in the archaeological record, where the iconography of Dagon blends with that of local Canaanite deities. Over time, the religious practices of the Philistines became a hybrid of their Aegean roots and the ancient traditions of the Levant. The Philistines' rise to power, however, was not without its challenges. The region in which they settled was strategically important and contested by several major powers. To the north, the Israelites were emerging as a distinct political entity, while to the east, the powerful Assyrian Empire was slowly extending its influence over the Levant. The Egyptians, long the dominant power in the region, were also a persistent threat. In such a volatile geopolitical landscape, the Philistines found themselves constantly navigating a delicate balance between independence and submission. At times, they allied with other regional powers, such as Egypt, in order to safeguard their autonomy. At other times, they found themselves embroiled in conflicts with the neighboring Israelites, leading to a series of wars and battles that would come to define their history. Perhaps the most famous of these conflicts is the biblical story of David and Goliath, which has immortalized the Philistines in popular culture as the quintessential enemy of the Israelites. The story, which depicts the young Israelite David defeating the Philistine giant Goliath in single combat, is emblematic of the broader struggles between the two peoples. While the biblical narrative portrays the Philistines as a militarily superior but ultimately defeated foe, the historical reality is more nuanced. The Philistines were not simply a defeated power but a people who fought fiercely for their land and their way of life. They were skilled warriors and tacticians, well trained in the art of siege warfare and equipped with the latest technologies of their time. Despite the Philistines' many achievements and their considerable military prowess, their cities were ultimately brought down by the rise of larger and more powerful empires. The Assyrians, under kings like Tiglath-Pileser III and Sennacherib, began to dominate the Levant, bringing the Philistine cities under their control. The Philistines, who had once been independent rulers of their coastal cities, were forced into submission. The Assyrians demanded tribute, and the Philistines were unable to resist the might of the Assyrian war machine. The rise of the Assyrian Empire marked the beginning of the end for the Philistine cities, which were slowly absorbed into the imperial structure of the Assyrians. The decline of the Philistine cities was further exacerbated by the rise of the Babylonian Empire. Under Nebuchadnezzar II, the Babylonians sought to expand their influence over the Levant, and the Philistines, weakened by years of Assyrian domination, were unable to fend off the new imperial power. By the early 6th century BCE, the once great cities of the Philistines had fallen, and their people were either killed, captured, or assimilated into the larger Babylonian Empire. The final fall of the Philistine cities marked the end of an era in the history of the ancient Near East, but their legacy lived on through the archaeological record. The rise of the Philistine cities, from their humble beginnings as migrant settlers to their eventual dominance of the Levantine coast, is a story of resilience, adaptation, and innovation. The Philistines were not merely a group of invaders, they were a people who forged their own identity in the crucible of conflict and cultural exchange. Their cities, their technologies, and their culture left a lasting mark on the ancient world, influencing the civilizations that followed. Though their political power eventually faded, the legacy of the Philistines endures in the stories, artifacts, and ruins they left behind. Through these remnants, we catch a glimpse of a people who once ruled the coastal plains of the Levant, shaping the course of history in ways both large and small. The rise of the Philistines was not only a tale of conquest and territorial expansion but also one of cultural transformation and adaptation. Over time, they became not just settlers or invaders but a people with a distinct identity, defined by their material culture, religious practices, and military innovations. Yet, despite their successes, their survival and growth were constantly threatened by the powers that surrounded them. The relationship between the Philistines and their neighbors, whether allies or enemies, was deeply intertwined, shaped by shifting allegiances, conflicts, and shared interests. This complex interplay of cooperation, rivalry, and resistance marked the Philistines' existence in the Levant, and their encounters with the neighboring peoples would define much of their history. One of the Philistines' most significant rivals were the Israelites, whose growing presence in the region presented a persistent challenge to Philistine dominance. The biblical narrative of the Philistines and Israelites is often oversimplified, depicting the two peoples as perpetual enemies locked in an ongoing struggle for supremacy. Yet the relationship between the Philistines and Israelites was far more complex than the simple dichotomy of good versus evil presented in many religious texts. While the Israelites and Philistines did indeed engage in numerous conflicts, there were also periods of cooperation, cultural exchange, and even mutual respect. The early history of the Philistine-Israelite relationship is marked by a series of skirmishes and battles, many of which are immortalized in the Hebrew Bible. One of the most famous stories from this period is that of David and Goliath. In this tale, the young David, an Israelite shepherd, defeats the giant Philistine warrior Goliath in single combat, thereby securing his place as the future king of Israel. This dramatic moment is often portrayed as a clear victory for Israel over its powerful adversary. However, the biblical account, while symbolically important, does not capture the full complexity of the relationship between the two peoples. For one, the Philistines were not a singular, monolithic force. They were a coalition of 5 city-states, each with its own rulers, agendas, and interests. Moreover, the Israelites themselves were not unified under a single monarchy until the reign of King David. The biblical story, though compelling, is more a reflection of the symbolic struggle between two peoples rather than a precise historical account. Despite the mythic nature of the David and Goliath story, there were indeed periods of intense rivalry between the Philistines and Israelites. The Philistines, with their superior military technology and well-fortified cities, posed a serious threat to the emerging Israelite tribes. The Israelites, on the other hand, were often portrayed as underdogs, fighting for their survival in a region dominated by powerful city-states and empires. This asymmetry in military power led to a series of battles in which the Philistines sought to assert their dominance, often raiding Israelite territory or attempting to control key strategic points. In turn, the Israelites, who were slowly consolidating their own power under leaders like Saul and David, resisted Philistine encroachment, engaging in counterattacks and seeking to expand their own territory. Yet the relationship between the two peoples was not solely defined by warfare. At times, the Philistines and Israelites sought to coexist or even form alliances. The mutual animosity between the two groups was often tempered by pragmatic considerations. For example, the biblical story of Samson, a judge of Israel, tells of a period in which the Israelites and Philistines were engaged in a delicate balance of power, with Samson using both diplomacy and force to navigate the tensions between the two peoples. There were also instances where Philistine and Israelite leaders exchanged gifts or sought truces, even if these efforts were often short-lived. In addition to the Israelites, the Philistines also had to contend with other powerful neighbors, including the Egyptians. Throughout the early centuries of Philistine settlement in the Levant, Egypt remained a dominant power in the region. The Egyptians, led by pharaohs like Ramses III, viewed the Philistines with a mixture of suspicion and respect. The Philistines were part of the larger wave of sea peoples who had attacked Egypt during Ramses III's reign, and while Egypt had successfully repelled these invaders, the Philistine settlement in the Levant remained a thorn in Egypt's side. Despite the tensions, Egypt and the Philistines shared certain interests. Egypt, with its need for a stable and secure southern border, sought to maintain peace with the Philistine cities in exchange for tribute. The Philistines, for their part, sought to establish a buffer zone against more powerful empires like the Assyrians and Babylonians. This mutual interest and stability occasionally led to diplomatic negotiations, though these were always fraught with the underlying reality of power struggles. The relationship between the Philistines and Egypt was, at its heart, one of cautious diplomacy. The Egyptians often sought to exert their influence over the Levant by controlling key cities and trade routes, but they were also aware of the strength and resilience of the Philistines. In some instances, the Egyptians relied on the Philistines as allies in their campaigns, while at other times, the Philistines found themselves caught between Egypt's ambitions and their own desire for autonomy. Over time, the Philistines grew increasingly self-reliant, building up their own military might and infrastructure, but the Egyptian threat remained a constant backdrop to their existence. As the Philistine cities flourished, they also faced growing challenges from the larger, more powerful empires of the ancient world. The Assyrians, in particular, represented a formidable threat. Under kings like Tiglath-Pileser III and Sennacherib, the Assyrian Empire expanded rapidly, bringing vast territories under its control. The Assyrians' military might and technological innovations, including their use of siege warfare and chariotry, made them nearly invincible on the battlefield. For the Philistines, this meant that their cities, long fortified and protected by their own military prowess, were now at risk of falling to a much more formidable enemy. The Assyrians, with their sophisticated bureaucracy and ruthless military campaigns, sought to expand their influence over the Levant. The Philistine cities, which had once been strong independent city-states, found themselves caught in a vice between the Assyrian Empire to the north and the Egyptian Empire to the south. In this precarious situation, the Philistines were forced to navigate a complex web of alliances and enmities, sometimes aligning themselves with the Egyptians, other times yielding to Assyrian demands. The fall of the Philistine cities to the Assyrians is a tragic chapter in their history. The Assyrians, known for their brutal tactics, laid siege to the Philistine cities, breaking their defenses and forcing them to submit to Assyrian control. As a result, the once proud Philistine cities were absorbed into the Assyrian Empire, their leaders replaced by Assyrian governors, and their autonomy effectively extinguished. The destruction of the Philistine cities marked the end of their political power in the Levant, but their cultural legacy lived on. Despite their defeat, the Philistines had made a lasting impact on the region, influencing the cultures and societies that followed. The rise and fall of the Philistines is a story of resilience, adaptation, and survival in a world constantly reshaped by war and shifting power dynamics. The Philistines, like many ancient peoples, were caught in the currents of larger geopolitical forces, yet they managed to carve out a unique space for themselves in the Levant. Their cities, technologies, and culture became intertwined with those of their neighbors, and their legacy endured long after their political power faded. The Philistines were not simply a footnote in the history of the ancient world, they were a vibrant, complex people whose influence shaped the course of events in the eastern Mediterranean for centuries. In the end, the Philistine story is one of both tragedy and triumph, a people who, despite being swept away by the forces of empire, left an indelible mark on the history of the ancient Near East. The decline of the Philistine civilization, though it may appear to be the inevitable result of external forces like the rise of the Assyrian and Babylonian empires, was also shaped by a number of internal factors, both social and political. Their fall was not merely a matter of military defeat but the culmination of a gradual erosion of the political, economic, and cultural systems that had once allowed them to thrive. The Philistine cities, which had been powerful and prosperous centers of commerce, religion, and military strength, faced a series of challenges that slowly undermined their ability to maintain their dominance in the Levant. One of the most significant internal challenges the Philistines faced was their own political fragmentation. The Philistine civilization was not a unified empire but rather a collection of 5 independent city-states: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. Each city-state had its own rulers, its own political agenda, and often its own military forces. This lack of political unity left the Philistines vulnerable to the growing power of external empires. In times of crisis, such as during the rise of the Assyrian Empire, the Philistine cities often struggled to coordinate their efforts in the face of overwhelming external threats. Each city-state was concerned with its own survival, and while there were alliances formed from time to time, the absence of a unified political structure made it difficult for the Philistines to present a cohesive front against more powerful forces. This fragmentation also meant that when one Philistine city fell to a conqueror, the others were often left to fend for themselves, unable to mount a collective defense. The political disunity of the Philistine cities was compounded by a growing sense of internal strife. As the cities prospered, they also became the centers of a complex social hierarchy, with elites controlling the wealth and resources of the cities, while the majority of the population lived in less prosperous conditions. The Philistine elite were primarily concerned with maintaining their power and control over the cities, which often led to social unrest. As the Philistine economy shifted and resources became more scarce due to external pressures, the gap between the elite and the common people widened. This social inequality, along with the lack of a unified political system, made it difficult for the Philistines to effectively resist external powers and maintain internal cohesion. Additionally, the Philistines faced economic challenges that further weakened their society. The coastal cities, which had once thrived as centers of trade and commerce, began to feel the pressure of competition from other, more powerful trade hubs in the eastern Mediterranean. The emergence of the Phoenician cities to the north, with their advanced maritime technology and extensive trade networks, gradually eroded the Philistines' dominance in commerce. Furthermore, the economic stability of the Philistine cities was undermined by the increasing instability in the region. As the Assyrian and Babylonian empires expanded, trade routes shifted, and the once prosperous Philistine cities were no longer as central to regional trade as they had once been. This loss of economic power weakened the Philistine cities, which relied heavily on their commercial success to maintain their wealth and influence. Culturally, the Philistines were facing challenges as well. Their society, which had initially blended elements of their Aegean heritage with the local Canaanite culture, was beginning to lose some of its distinctiveness. The Philistines had been able to maintain a unique identity for several centuries, but as the political and economic climate grew more hostile, their cultural institutions were increasingly overshadowed by the dominant powers in the region. The rise of the Assyrians, and later the Babylonians, meant that the Philistines were drawn into the orbit of larger imperial cultures. Their cities became less autonomous, and their religious and artistic practices began to be influenced, or even suppressed, by the foreign powers that controlled them. The Philistine gods, particularly Dagon, who had once been central to their religious life, were marginalized or absorbed into the religious systems of their conquerors. This loss of cultural identity further contributed to the weakening of the Philistine civilization. The military decline of the Philistines was also a crucial factor in their downfall. Although the Philistines had once been formidable warriors, known for their use of iron weapons and their military expertise, they were increasingly outmatched by the larger and more sophisticated armies of the Assyrians, Babylonians, and Egyptians. The Assyrian military, in particular, was unmatched in its ability to wage war. Their use of advanced siege techniques, chariotry, and well-coordinated armies made them virtually unstoppable. The Philistines, with their smaller and less organized forces, were unable to defend their cities against the might of the Assyrian Empire. Over time, the once mighty Philistine cities fell one by one to Assyrian invasions. Ashkelon, one of the most important Philistine cities, fell to the Assyrians in 604 BCE, while the others slowly succumbed to similar fates. The Assyrians, under kings like Tiglath-Pileser III and Sennacherib, did not simply destroy the Philistine cities, they systematically dismantled their political structures, replacing local rulers with Assyrian governors and forcing the cities to pay tribute. The Philistine elites, once powerful and autonomous, were now subjugated to Assyrian control. The Philistine military, once known for its skill and iron weaponry, was now powerless against the Assyrian war machine. The cities of the Philistines, which had once been symbols of their strength and independence, became vassals of the Assyrians, their power and influence diminished beyond recognition. The eventual fall of the Philistine cities marked the end of their civilization as an independent political entity. However, it did not mark the end of the Philistines as a people. While the cities were absorbed into the Assyrian and later Babylonian empires, many Philistines were displaced, their people scattered across the region. Some may have been taken into captivity, while others may have fled to nearby regions, blending into the larger populations of the ancient world. Despite their political defeat, the Philistine legacy endured in the form of cultural and archaeological remnants, offering a glimpse into the once flourishing civilization that had dominated the coastal plains of the Levant. The fall of the Philistines, then, is not simply a story of military defeat, it is a story of the complexities of cultural identity, political fragmentation, and the shifting tides of history. The Philistines had once been a vibrant civilization that played a pivotal role in the ancient world. They had established a thriving economy, built powerful cities, and forged a unique cultural identity that blended Aegean and Canaanite influences. Yet, like many civilizations before and after them, the forces of external invasion, internal division, and economic decline ultimately brought about their fall. The Philistines were not simply a people who succumbed to the power of others, they were a people whose civilization was shaped by their interactions with the world around them, and whose downfall was a consequence of their inability to adapt to the changing realities of the ancient Near East. In the end, the Philistine legacy is a reminder of the fragility of civilization. Their rise and fall serve as a testament to the dynamic nature of history, where even the most powerful peoples and cultures can be swept away by the winds of change. Yet, even in their defeat, the Philistines left a lasting imprint on the history of the ancient world. Their cities, Their innovations, and their unique cultural blend continue to captivate historians and archaeologists, offering valuable insights into a civilization that once flourished at the crossroads of the ancient Near East. Through their story, we are reminded that the forces that shape history are often beyond the control of any one people, and that even the greatest of civilizations can eventually fade into the annals of time. The Philistine civilization, despite its eventual downfall, left an enduring legacy in the annals of history. The imprint of their culture, while subsumed by the great empires that followed, remained embedded in the archaeological and historical records, offering glimpses into a complex society that existed for several centuries on the eastern Mediterranean coast. The Philistines were not a fleeting phenomenon. Their influence was deeply felt in the region, both during their time and long after their political power faded. Understanding their legacy requires not only examining their contributions to art, technology, and warfare but also reflecting on the broader context of their existence in the ancient Near East. The Philistine cities were among the most sophisticated in the region, both in terms of urban planning and architectural development. These cities were strategically placed along the Levantine coast, providing access to vital trade routes that connected the Mediterranean world. The cities were designed with both military defense and commerce in mind, reflecting the dual needs of a people caught between competing powers and striving to maintain their autonomy. The fortifications of the Philistine cities were among the most impressive of their time. Massive city walls, reinforced gates, and strategically placed towers formed a defensive network that protected the cities from external invasions. These defensive structures, however, were not merely military in function. They also symbolized the strength and resilience of the Philistine people, projecting an image of power to both their allies and adversaries. The urban planning of the Philistine cities reveals much about their society and priorities. These cities were not just fortified strongholds, they were vibrant hubs of trade, culture, and religious activity. The streets of the Philistine cities were laid out in a way that facilitated the movement of people and goods, with clear divisions between residential, commercial, and religious areas. The city of Ashkelon, for example, featured wide streets and organized districts that were designed to accommodate a thriving commercial economy. At the heart of these cities stood large public spaces, often dominated by temples and other religious structures. These spaces were not only centers of worship but also served as gathering places for the community, where political and social matters were discussed and decisions made. The Philistine architectural style was influenced by both their Aegean roots and the surrounding Canaanite culture. Their use of ashlar masonry, a technique they brought with them from the Aegean, can still be seen in the ruins of their cities today. This method of stone construction, characterized by carefully cut and precisely fitted stones, allowed the Philistines to build sturdy, long-lasting structures. It was a skill that set them apart from their neighbors and became a hallmark of their architectural identity. In addition to their stone buildings, the Philistines also constructed large warehouses and storage facilities to support their trade networks. These buildings were often located near the docks and marketplaces, ensuring that goods could be easily transported and distributed throughout the region. Beyond architecture, the Philistines were known for their technological innovations, particularly in the realm of metallurgy. The Philistines were among the first in the ancient world to master the use of iron, a development that had profound implications for their military and economic success. While the Canaanites and other neighboring cultures had relied primarily on bronze, the Philistines' ability to produce iron tools and weapons gave them a distinct advantage. Iron, being stronger and more durable than bronze, allowed the Philistines to produce superior weapons, including swords, spears, and armor. This technological edge made the Philistine military a formidable force, capable of defending their cities against invaders and expanding their influence in the region. The Philistines' ironworking skills also had a significant impact on their economy. The production of iron tools and weapons became a major industry in Philistine cities, contributing to their wealth and ability to control key trade routes. The ability to forge high-quality iron goods allowed the Philistines to engage in trade with neighboring cultures, further cementing their role as important players in the Mediterranean economy. This economic prosperity, in turn, supported the development of their cities and allowed for the growth of a strong military infrastructure. The Philistine economy, which was built on trade, metallurgy, and agriculture, was well integrated into the broader economic systems of the ancient Near East. The Philistines exported their iron goods, pottery, and textiles to other Mediterranean societies, while also importing luxury items, raw materials, and foodstuffs from distant lands. This interconnectedness with other cultures helped to shape the Philistine identity, blending foreign influences with their indigenous traditions. Religion played a central role in Philistine society, and their religious practices offer insight into their worldview and cultural values. The Philistines worshipped a pantheon of gods, with Dagon being the most prominent. Dagon, often depicted as a fish-headed deity, was associated with the sea and agriculture. He was believed to be a protector of the Philistine people, ensuring their prosperity and success in both warfare and agriculture. The Philistines built large temples to Dagon in their cities, where elaborate rituals and sacrifices were performed to appease the gods. These temples were not only places of worship but also symbols of Philistine power and identity. The religious structures were grand and imposing, reflecting the importance of religion in maintaining social order and political stability. In addition to Dagon, the Philistines also worshipped other deities, many of whom were likely borrowed from neighboring cultures. The Philistine religious system was characterized by a degree of syncretism, blending their native beliefs with the religious practices of the Canaanites and other groups in the region. This was particularly evident in their use of religious symbols and iconography, which often incorporated elements from both Aegean and Canaanite traditions. For example, the Philistines adopted Canaanite gods such as Baal and Asherah, as well as the worship of local spirits and ancestors. This blending of religious practices reflects the Philistines' adaptability and their ability to integrate into the cultural and religious fabric of the ancient Near East, while still maintaining their own unique identity. Despite their advancements in architecture, metallurgy, and religion, the Philistines were not immune to the forces of history. The rise of the Assyrian Empire in the 8th century BCE brought about the first serious challenge to Philistine independence. The Assyrians, known for their military prowess and imperial ambitions, began to expand their territory into the Levant, gradually bringing the Philistine cities under their control. The Philistine cities, once autonomous and prosperous, were now forced to pay tribute to the Assyrians and accept their rule. The Assyrians did not simply conquer the Philistines, they systematically dismantled their political structures, replacing local rulers with Assyrian governors and forcing the cities to adopt Assyrian customs and policies. This loss of autonomy was a devastating blow to the Philistine people, who had long prided themselves on their independence and military strength. As the Assyrians exerted their control over the region, the Philistines were further weakened by internal strife and social unrest. The once vibrant cities of the Philistines, which had been centers of trade, culture, and military power, began to decline. Their economy suffered as trade routes shifted and their ability to maintain military power waned. The Philistine elite, once dominant in their society, found themselves increasingly powerless in the face of Assyrian imperialism. The cultural and religious practices that had once defined the Philistine identity were increasingly suppressed as Assyrian gods and customs took hold. The fall of the Philistine cities was not just a military defeat but a cultural transformation, as the once proud civilization was absorbed into the larger Assyrian Empire. The legacy of the Philistines, however, did not vanish with their political defeat. Their contributions to the ancient world, particularly in the fields of metallurgy, architecture, and religion, continued to influence the cultures that followed. The Philistine cities, with their advanced urban planning and impressive fortifications, served as models for later civilizations in the region. Their mastery of ironworking laid the groundwork for future technological innovations, and their religious practices influenced the development of the gods and rituals of neighboring peoples. Even after their political power had faded, the memory of the Philistines lived on through their archaeological remnants, which continue to provide valuable insights into their once great civilization. In the end, the Philistine legacy is one of both triumph and tragedy. They were a people who forged their own identity through a combination of adaptation and innovation, creating a civilization that was uniquely their own. Yet, like so many civilizations throughout history, their rise was followed by their eventual fall. The Philistines, once powerful and proud, were swept away by the larger forces of empire and history. Nevertheless, their story remains an integral part of the history of the ancient Near East, a reminder of the complex and ever-shifting dynamics that shape the rise and fall of civilizations. The Philistine legacy in the ancient Near East, while marked by decline and eventual conquest, continued to echo through the ages, influencing cultures far beyond their time. Although their cities fell to the overwhelming power of empires like Assyria and Babylon, the contributions of the Philistines were not easily erased. Their material culture, religious practices, and technological innovations became part of the broader fabric of ancient Mediterranean civilizations, continuing to impact the region in ways that would unfold over centuries. Understanding the enduring influence of the Philistines is not only about analyzing their direct contributions but also recognizing the subtle ways in which their identity persisted long after their political power had been extinguished. One of the most significant aspects of the Philistine legacy was their technological advancements, particularly in metallurgy. The Philistines were pioneers in the use of iron, a technological leap that had far-reaching consequences for the ancient world. While many cultures in the eastern Mediterranean had used bronze for centuries, the Philistines' mastery of iron gave them a crucial advantage in warfare, agriculture, and craftsmanship. The introduction of iron weapons allowed the Philistines to field armies with superior technology compared to their neighbors. Spears, swords, and shields made from iron were not only stronger than their bronze counterparts but also more durable and cost-effective to produce, making them an essential tool for the Philistine military. This mastery of ironworking was not an isolated achievement, it influenced the development of surrounding cultures, many of whom adopted Philistine ironworking techniques. As the Philistine cities fell under the rule of larger empires, their technology spread, contributing to the rise of ironworking as a dominant force in the ancient world. By the time the Babylonians and later the Persians extended their control over the Levant, iron had become the standard material for tools and weapons, and much of that transformation can be traced back to the Philistine innovations. But the Philistine influence on technology extended beyond the battlefield. Their contributions to urban planning and architectural design also left a lasting mark on the region. The fortified cities of the Philistines were some of the most advanced in the ancient world, with impressive walls, gates, and watchtowers that set new standards in defensive architecture. These innovations in fortification techniques were adopted by subsequent civilizations, particularly the Israelites, who, in their struggles with the Philistines, also built heavily fortified cities. The construction methods and designs pioneered by the Philistines can be seen in the remains of later cities throughout the Levant, a testament to the lasting influence of their architectural achievements. The urban planning of the Philistine cities also had a profound effect on the development of city layouts in the ancient Mediterranean. Their cities were designed to accommodate both military defense and the needs of a thriving commercial center. Wide streets, organized districts for residential and commercial use, and central gathering places for religious and social activities became common features in the urban designs of later civilizations. The Philistine cities, such as Ashkelon, were strategically located along trade routes, making them central hubs of commerce in the ancient world. Their influence on trade and urban infrastructure can still be traced in the layout of many cities in the eastern Mediterranean region that followed. Culturally, the Philistines were adept at absorbing and adapting the influences of neighboring peoples, blending their Aegean roots with the indigenous cultures of the Levant. This syncretism allowed the Philistines to maintain a distinct identity even as they integrated into the broader cultural landscape. One of the most notable examples of this blending is seen in their religious practices. The Philistines worshipped a pantheon of gods, with Dagon as their principal deity. Dagon, the god of the sea and agriculture, played a central role in Philistine religious life. The Philistine temples dedicated to Dagon were not just places of worship but also centers of political and social activity, reflecting the deep connection between religion and governance in Philistine society. However, as the Philistines encountered other cultures, particularly the Canaanites, Egyptians, and later the Assyrians, their religious practices began to incorporate elements from these neighboring traditions. The result was a religious system that, while rooted in Philistine beliefs, was increasingly shaped by external influences. For instance, the Philistines adopted the worship of Baal and Asherah, two of the most prominent deities in Canaanite religion, alongside their veneration of Dagon. This syncretism can be seen in the archaeological remains of Philistine temples, where Canaanite-style religious icons and symbols were often found alongside those of the Philistine pantheon. The religious practices of the Philistines, which had once been unique, became part of the broader cultural and religious milieu of the ancient Near East. The Philistine ability to adapt and incorporate elements from neighboring cultures was also evident in their art and material culture. The Philistine pottery, for example, evolved over time, incorporating influences from both the Aegean world and the indigenous Canaanite styles. Early Philistine pottery was characterized by bold, geometric patterns in a distinctive bichrome style, which set it apart from the more restrained Canaanite ceramics. Over time, however, Philistine pottery began to adopt Canaanite motifs, blending the two styles into a hybrid form that was distinctly Philistine. This blending of artistic traditions reflects the Philistines' ability to navigate the complex cultural landscape of the ancient Near East, taking inspiration from their neighbors while maintaining their own cultural identity. The Philistines were also skilled craftsmen, producing textiles, jewelry, and other luxury goods that were highly prized in the ancient world. Their fine pottery, which was often decorated with intricate designs, was traded extensively throughout the Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence shows that Philistine pottery was found not only in the Levant but also in Egypt, Cyprus, and even as far as the Aegean world, indicating the far-reaching influence of Philistine craftsmanship. The Philistine ability to produce high-quality goods contributed to their prosperity, and their reputation as skilled artisans helped them maintain a presence in international trade networks long after their political decline. Despite the eventual fall of their cities to the Assyrians and later the Babylonians, the cultural and technological contributions of the Philistines were not easily forgotten. Their influence on the region continued to reverberate through the centuries, particularly in the areas of metallurgy, architecture, urban planning, and religious practices. Even after the Philistine cities were absorbed into larger empires, their innovations became part of the broader cultural heritage of the ancient Near East. The Philistines' impact on their neighbors can be seen in the way their military technologies, architectural designs, and cultural practices were adopted and adapted by other civilizations. The Assyrians, for example, who conquered the Philistine cities, incorporated many of the Philistine innovations into their own military and architectural strategies. The use of iron, which the Philistines had pioneered, became a standard practice in Assyrian warfare, contributing to their own military dominance. Similarly, the Assyrians adopted Philistine construction techniques in the building of their own fortresses and cities, further cementing the Philistines' influence on the region. While the political power of the Philistines may have faded with the rise of larger empires, their cultural influence persisted long after their fall. Their contributions to the technological, architectural, and religious landscapes of the ancient Near East laid the foundation for many of the developments that followed. The story of the Philistines, therefore, is not merely one of a defeated people but one of a civilization that, through its innovations and cultural exchanges, helped shape the course of ancient history. The legacy of the Philistines reminds us that even in the face of overwhelming external pressures, the influence of a culture can endure and continue to resonate long after its political power has dissipated. In this way, the Philistine civilization, though ultimately absorbed into larger imperial systems, left a lasting mark on the ancient world. The echoes of their innovations, their art, their religious practices, and their technological advancements reverberated through the centuries, continuing to influence the cultures that followed. Through their story, we are reminded that the legacy of a civilization is not solely defined by its rise and fall but by the lasting impact it has on the world around it. Even in their defeat, the Philistines contributed to the shaping of the ancient Mediterranean world, ensuring that their influence would not be easily forgotten. The relationship between the Philistines and their neighboring civilizations was complex and multifaceted. Their interactions with the Egyptians, Canaanites, Israelites, and other groups in the Levant reveal a great deal about their culture, military strategy, and political ambitions. Despite the image of the Philistines as a distinct, isolated people, their history is deeply intertwined with the larger geopolitical currents of the ancient Near East. As one of the key players in the region during the early Iron Age, the Philistines were both shaped by and sought to shape the world around them. Their influence, though ultimately waning, marked the course of history in significant ways. When the Philistines first arrived on the eastern Mediterranean coast, they found themselves among peoples who had already established deep roots in the region. The Canaanites, with their long-standing presence in the Levant, were the primary inhabitants of the coastal and inland areas. They had established well-developed city-states, such as Tyre, Sidon, and Ugarit, which were centers of commerce and culture. The Philistines, with their Aegean roots, brought new technologies and military strategies that allowed them to quickly gain a foothold in the region. However, this advantage was not without its challenges, as they faced competition and occasional conflict with the indigenous Canaanite populations. In their early encounters with the Canaanites, the Philistines were not merely invaders, they were also settlers, bringing with them a new culture and way of life. This process of cultural exchange, while at times violent, also led to the blending of traditions. The Philistines adopted elements of Canaanite religion, architecture, and trade practices, while also introducing their own Aegean customs. Over time, this symbiotic relationship contributed to the growth of the Philistine cities, which became thriving urban centers of commerce, religion, and military power. The Philistines, in many ways, represented a new wave of cultural innovation in the region, a blending of Aegean and Canaanite elements that would come to define their identity. However, the relationship between the Philistines and the Israelites was far more contentious. The Israelites, who had recently emerged as a distinct cultural and political entity, saw the Philistines as a major threat to their existence. The two groups engaged in numerous conflicts, many of which are documented in the Hebrew Bible. The most famous of these encounters is the story of David and Goliath, in which the young Israelite shepherd David defeats the giant Philistine warrior Goliath in single combat. While this biblical story is undoubtedly symbolic, it highlights the ongoing struggle between the two peoples for control of the Levant. The Israelites, initially a collection of loosely connected tribes, were often portrayed as the underdogs in their battles with the more powerful Philistine cities. The Philistines, with their fortified cities, advanced military technology, and extensive trade networks, were a formidable force. In contrast, the Israelites, who were organized into small tribal groups, faced significant challenges in establishing their dominance. Yet, despite the Philistines' military advantages, the Israelites were able to gain the upper hand, thanks in part to the leadership of figures like Saul and David. The David and Goliath narrative, while exaggerated in its mythic elements, illustrates the larger struggle for survival and control between the two peoples. Despite their fierce rivalries, the relationship between the Israelites and the Philistines was not purely adversarial. There were times when the two groups were forced to cooperate or at least engage in diplomacy. The Philistine cities, which were strategically located along the coast, controlled important trade routes and had a significant influence on the economy of the region. As such, their relationship with the Israelites was not purely defined by warfare. There were periods of truce, where both sides negotiated peace or established trade agreements. The Philistines, for their part, recognized the growing power of the Israelites and sought to maintain a balance of power in the region. For instance, during the reign of David, the Philistines were occasionally allied with the Israelites in opposition to common enemies, such as the Amalekites. At the same time, the Philistines were also embroiled in their own conflicts with larger powers to the south and east. The Egyptian Empire, which was in a period of decline by the time the Philistines settled in the Levant, still exerted significant influence over the region. The Egyptians, who had previously controlled much of the eastern Mediterranean, found themselves increasingly challenged by the Philistines and other groups, such as the Sea Peoples. The Philistines, despite their military prowess, were not immune to the ambitions of the Egyptians. Throughout the early centuries of Philistine settlement, the Egyptians sought to reassert their dominance in the region. While the Philistines resisted Egyptian control, they were also pragmatic, at times accepting Egyptian suzerainty in exchange for autonomy in other areas. In the broader geopolitical context of the ancient Near East, the Philistines were caught between two powerful empires, Egypt to the south and the Assyrians to the north. The Assyrian Empire, under kings like Tiglath-Pileser III and Sennacherib, expanded rapidly during the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, and its military campaigns began to encroach on Philistine territory. The Philistines, who had once been a thorn in the side of the Egyptians, now faced a new, even more formidable threat from the Assyrians. The Assyrians, with their advanced military technology and ruthless tactics, proved to be a much greater challenge than the Egyptians had ever been. The Assyrians sought to expand their control over the Levant, and the Philistine cities, which had once been autonomous and powerful, were forced to submit to Assyrian authority. The Assyrians, known for their brutal treatment of conquered peoples, began a campaign of conquest that would ultimately lead to the fall of the Philistine city-states. The Assyrian siege tactics, including the use of battering rams, siege towers, and psychological warfare, proved effective against the heavily fortified Philistine cities. The fall of Ashkelon in 604 BCE marked the beginning of the end for Philistine independence. In the aftermath of Assyrian conquest, the Philistines were subjected to a harsh imperial rule. Assyrian governors were installed in the former Philistine cities, and the people were forced to pay heavy tribute. The once proud Philistine cities were reduced to vassal states, and their power was eclipsed by the overwhelming strength of the Assyrian military. However, the Philistines did not vanish completely. While their political power had been shattered, their cultural and religious practices persisted, albeit in a more subdued form. The Philistines' material culture, particularly their pottery, military artifacts, and religious icons, continued to be studied and revered in later centuries. Despite the subjugation of the Philistine cities, their legacy was not entirely erased. Their technological advancements, particularly in metallurgy, were passed down to neighboring cultures, influencing the broader Mediterranean world. The Philistine military innovations, including their use of iron weapons, were adopted by the Assyrians and other groups in the region. Even their religious practices, which had been a blend of indigenous Canaanite traditions and Aegean influences, left an imprint on the religious landscapes of the ancient Near East. The Philistines' ability to adapt and assimilate elements from surrounding cultures allowed them to survive, in some form, within the empires that absorbed them. Their eventual disappearance from the historical record, marked by the fall of the Philistine cities and their integration into larger empires, was not a sudden event but a gradual process of absorption. Over time, the Philistines ceased to be a distinct political entity and became part of the larger tapestry of ancient Near Eastern cultures. Their language, customs, and traditions gradually merged with those of the Israelites, the Canaanites, and the broader Mediterranean world. Yet, even in this absorption, the Philistines left an indelible mark on the history of the ancient world. The Philistine story is one of resilience, adaptation, and ultimately, integration. Though their cities fell and their political power diminished, their cultural influence endured in the ancient world. From their military innovations to their contributions in metallurgy, religion, and urban planning, the Philistines played a crucial role in shaping the course of history in the Levant and beyond. Their interactions with their neighbors, the Egyptians, Canaanites, Israelites, and Assyrians, were defined by both conflict and cooperation, and their legacy serves as a testament to the complexity of the ancient world. The Philistines, though ultimately absorbed into larger empires, remain an essential chapter in the history of the ancient Near East. As the Philistine civilization met its decline, one of the most striking aspects of their legacy is the way they have been remembered, or often misunderstood, in the historical and cultural narratives of the ancient world. In particular, the biblical portrayal of the Philistines, while influential, has often overshadowed a more nuanced understanding of their civilization. For centuries, the Philistines were depicted primarily as antagonists to the Israelites, with little attention given to their cultural, technological, and social achievements. This one-dimensional image, shaped by religious texts and later cultural interpretations, has only begun to be reconsidered in modern scholarship and archaeology. What the Bible presents as a clear-cut tale of conflict between the Philistines and Israelites is in reality a far more complex and multi-layered narrative of cultural exchanges, political rivalries, and mutual influence. The biblical story of the Philistines is well known, particularly through the famous account of David and Goliath, which portrays the Philistine giant Goliath as the embodiment of the Philistine threat to the Israelites. In the Hebrew Bible, the Philistines are consistently cast as the enemy, a people who stand in opposition to the Israelite God and are engaged in an ongoing battle for dominance over the land of Canaan. This image of the Philistines as foreign invaders and pagan idolaters has been deeply ingrained in Western cultural memory, particularly in the Judeo-Christian tradition. For centuries, the Philistines were depicted as a barbaric and uncivilized people, defined primarily by their conflicts with the Israelites. The Bible, however, does not provide a full picture of who the Philistines were, their origins, or their contributions to the ancient world. It paints a portrait of a society that existed only as an adversary to Israel, often overlooking the depth of Philistine culture, technology, and sophistication. However, archaeological evidence and historical research over the last century have begun to challenge this simplistic view. Excavations of ancient Philistine cities like Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Gaza have revealed a far more complex picture of Philistine society. These cities, far from being mere military outposts or symbols of oppression, were vibrant urban centers, teeming with advanced technologies, thriving trade, and rich cultural life. The Philistines were skilled artisans, metalworkers, and builders, and their cities were among the most fortified and architecturally advanced in the ancient Near East. Their use of iron, for example, revolutionized military technology, and their craftsmanship in pottery and textiles was highly regarded throughout the Mediterranean. Archaeological findings have also uncovered significant religious artifacts, including altars and inscriptions dedicated to their gods, such as Dagon and Baal, indicating a rich and diverse religious life. The shift from viewing the Philistines solely as biblical antagonists to understanding them as a complex and multifaceted civilization has been slow, but it has led to a deeper appreciation of their place in ancient history. This reassessment of the Philistines is not merely a modern reinterpretation, but rather a rediscovery of the facts that have long been obscured by religious and political narratives. The Philistines were not merely invaders from the Aegean, as once believed, but a people who adapted to and integrated with the cultures of the Levant. They were neither invincible nor an unchanging monolith, rather, they were a dynamic and evolving society, shaped by interactions with the Canaanites, Egyptians, Israelites, and others. Perhaps the most significant change in our understanding of the Philistines comes from archaeological evidence that reveals the blending of their Aegean heritage with the local Canaanite culture. Initially, scholars believed that the Philistines arrived as a distinct group of sea peoples, a term used to describe various maritime groups that migrated to the eastern Mediterranean around the 12th century BCE. This theory suggested that the Philistines were a foreign invasion, bringing with them their own customs, language, and material culture. However, more recent studies have suggested that the Philistines were not simply invaders but settlers who established a hybrid culture, drawing on both their Aegean roots and the traditions of the indigenous peoples of the Levant. The blending of these two cultures is evident in Philistine pottery, which combines Aegean styles with local motifs. Early Philistine pottery, with its distinct geometric patterns, was influenced by Aegean designs, but over time, it incorporated elements from Canaanite traditions. The result was a unique style of pottery that served as both a practical tool and a symbol of cultural identity. In addition to pottery, the Philistines also adopted local agricultural practices, including the cultivation of grains, olives, and grapes, which were essential to their economy and survival. These agricultural innovations, along with their mastery of ironworking and metal crafts, helped the Philistines establish themselves as one of the major powers in the eastern Mediterranean during the early Iron Age. The question of language is another critical aspect in understanding the Philistines' identity. The Philistines spoke a language that, while still debated among scholars, seems to have been a form of an Aegean dialect. This connection to the Aegean world suggests that the Philistines brought with them elements of their own culture, including language, when they settled along the coast of Canaan. However, their interactions with the surrounding cultures also influenced their language, and by the time of their peak, the Philistine language had likely become a blend of Aegean, Canaanite, and other regional languages. This linguistic fusion further underscores the complexity of Philistine identity and their integration into the broader Levantine world. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Philistine civilization is their religious practices. The Philistines worshipped a pantheon of gods, with Dagon being the most prominent among them. Dagon, the god of grain and the sea, was central to the Philistine religious system, and temples dedicated to him have been found in several Philistine cities. The religious life of the Philistines was marked by a high degree of syncretism, as they absorbed religious practices from the various cultures with which they interacted. In addition to Dagon, the Philistines also worshipped other gods, such as Baal and Asherah, deities common to Canaanite religion. This blending of religious traditions illustrates the Philistines' ability to adapt and integrate foreign influences, while still maintaining their own cultural identity. The Philistine religious practices also offer insights into their social structure and worldview. Archaeological excavations at Philistine sites have uncovered altars, incense burners, and other religious artifacts, revealing that religious rituals played a central role in the daily life of the Philistines. These rituals were not just about appeasing the gods, they were also an important means of social cohesion, bringing together individuals from different classes and communities. Religious festivals and sacrifices, often held at grand temples, provided opportunities for the people to unite in common cause, reinforcing the power of the elite and the role of the gods in maintaining order and prosperity. Despite their cultural sophistication, the Philistines were not immune to the larger geopolitical forces of the ancient world. Their cities, located along the fertile coastal plain of Canaan, were constantly vulnerable to the ambitions of neighboring empires, including Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon. The Philistines were caught in the crossfire of these imperial struggles, and over time, they found themselves increasingly subject to foreign rule. The decline of Philistine power can be traced to the rise of the Assyrian Empire, which conquered their cities one by one, eventually subsuming them into the larger Assyrian state. However, even under foreign rule, the Philistines did not disappear completely. Their cultural practices, religious beliefs, and technological innovations continued to influence the societies that replaced them, leaving a lasting imprint on the region. The fall of the Philistines marked the end of an era, but their legacy did not vanish. Archaeologists continue to study the remains of their cities, temples, and artifacts, uncovering new insights into their way of life. The Philistines, once seen as mere antagonists in the biblical narrative, are now recognized as a civilization with a rich and complex history. The reconsideration of the Philistines, both in terms of their cultural contributions and their interactions with neighboring peoples, has transformed our understanding of the ancient world. They were not just enemies to the Israelites but a people who played a central role in the shaping of the ancient Mediterranean world. Through their story, we gain a deeper appreciation of the forces that shaped the history of the Levant and the broader ancient Near East. As the history of the Philistines unfolds through the lens of archaeology and scholarly interpretation, one of the most compelling aspects is their evolving relationship with their environment. Situated on the eastern Mediterranean coast, the Philistines were positioned at a crossroads of different cultures, climates, and trade routes, which profoundly influenced their development as a society. Their ability to adapt to this diverse environment, while also shaping it to their own needs, offers valuable insights into the resourcefulness and resilience of the Philistine people. The landscape they inhabited, the fertile coastal plains of the Levant, with its proximity to both the Mediterranean Sea and the inland hills, was as much a stage for their civilization as the cities they built upon it. The geographical location of the Philistine cities was not a mere accident of fate but a deliberate choice that reflected their strategic mindset. The cities they established along the coast, such as Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Gaza, were not only crucial for military defense but were also well placed for commerce and trade. These coastal cities provided easy access to Mediterranean shipping routes, allowing the Philistines to engage in extensive trade networks. The Philistine ability to tap into the larger Mediterranean economy was a defining feature of their success as a civilization. They were able to exchange goods, ideas, and technologies with distant cultures, which in turn enriched their society. At the same time, the Philistine cities were strategically positioned near fertile agricultural land, which allowed them to support their growing populations. The region's mild climate and fertile soil made it ideal for cultivating crops such as wheat, barley, grapes, and olives, essential staples for the Philistine economy. Agriculture was the backbone of their economy, supporting not only their food supply but also trade goods that could be exchanged with neighboring peoples. The Philistines were particularly skilled at cultivating olive trees and producing olive oil, which was a highly sought-after commodity in the ancient world. Their access to both fertile land and vital trade routes allowed them to thrive as agricultural and commercial powerhouses. The proximity to the Mediterranean also gave the Philistines access to maritime resources, such as fish and timber, which were crucial for building ships and sustaining their naval capabilities. The Philistines were known to be skilled sailors, and their navy played a key role in their ability to control coastal areas and defend their cities from external threats. Their naval prowess was not just a defensive strategy but also a means of projecting power, allowing them to engage in trade, as well as conflict, with other Mediterranean civilizations. The Philistines understood the importance of maritime trade and were able to utilize their coastal cities as hubs for the exchange of goods such as pottery, textiles, and metals. In terms of architecture, the Philistines used the resources available to them to create fortified cities that could withstand military sieges. The construction of city walls, gates, and watchtowers was a critical aspect of Philistine urban planning. Their cities were heavily fortified, with thick walls and reinforced gates designed to defend against invaders. The use of ashlar masonry, a technique that involved carefully cut and fitted stones, was a hallmark of Philistine construction. This type of masonry, which the Philistines inherited from their Aegean roots, allowed them to build sturdy, long-lasting structures that could withstand the test of time. Inside these fortified cities, the Philistines also built a variety of structures to support their urban life. Public buildings, such as temples, were central to Philistine society, serving not only as places of worship but also as centers of social and political activity. The grand scale of these temples suggests that religion played a central role in the Philistine worldview, and they were constructed as symbols of divine protection and power. These religious structures were often strategically located at the heart of the cities, reinforcing the importance of religion in maintaining order and unity. The Philistines were also adept at utilizing the natural resources available to them for military purposes. Their mastery of ironworking, for example, allowed them to create superior weapons and armor. While the surrounding cultures, such as the Canaanites, primarily used bronze for their weapons, the Philistines were among the first in the region to adopt iron, which proved to be a game-changer in their military tactics. Iron weapons were stronger, more durable, and easier to produce than their bronze counterparts, giving the Philistine armies a significant advantage over their enemies. Their superior weaponry, along with their strategic use of fortifications and fortified cities, made them formidable opponents in battle. This resourcefulness extended beyond the battlefield. The Philistines' understanding of agriculture, coupled with their access to fertile land and trade routes, allowed them to build an economy that was both diversified and resilient. While much of the ancient world relied on subsistence agriculture, the Philistines were able to produce surplus crops that could be traded with neighboring cultures. This surplus helped fuel the growth of their cities and contributed to their prosperity. In addition to agricultural goods, the Philistines produced high-quality pottery, textiles, and metal goods, which they traded extensively throughout the Mediterranean. Their ability to engage in long-distance trade helped them build wealth and establish themselves as key players in the region's economy. The Philistine mastery of technology, particularly in the fields of metallurgy and urban planning, was deeply connected to their environment. They did not simply use the land around them for sustenance, they also shaped the landscape to suit their needs. The construction of cities, fortifications, and military structures required a deep understanding of the local geography and available resources. The Philistines adapted their building techniques to the specific challenges posed by their environment, using local stone for construction and developing sophisticated methods of water management to sustain their growing populations. The Philistines' relationship with their environment was also shaped by their interactions with other peoples in the region. While they were influenced by neighboring cultures, such as the Canaanites and Egyptians, they also left their own mark on the world around them. Their influence can be seen in the way they modified their environment to support their urban lifestyle. The Philistine cities were carefully planned to maximize both defense and accessibility, with wide streets, organized districts, and central public spaces. This urban planning was not only a reflection of their military needs but also of their cultural values. The Philistines were a people who valued both security and community, and their cities were designed to reflect these priorities. However, as the Philistine civilization declined under the pressure of foreign invasions, particularly from the Assyrians, their relationship with the environment became more precarious. The Assyrian conquest of the Philistine cities marked a turning point in their ability to control and manipulate the landscape. The Assyrians, known for their brutal military tactics and imperial ambitions, systematically dismantled the Philistine cities, breaking down their fortifications and replacing local rulers with Assyrian governors. This loss of political autonomy had far-reaching consequences for the Philistine people, who were no longer able to shape their environment in the same way they once had. Despite their subjugation, the Philistine cultural and technological legacy continued to resonate in the region. Even under Assyrian control, many of the architectural and military innovations pioneered by the Philistines were incorporated into the broader fabric of ancient Near Eastern society. The use of iron, for instance, was adopted by the Assyrians and became a standard practice in their military. The Assyrians also learned from the Philistine city-building techniques, particularly in terms of fortifications and urban planning. The Philistines' deep understanding of their environment, both natural and social, left an indelible mark on the ancient world. In the end, the Philistines' ability to adapt to and shape their environment was one of the key factors in their rise to prominence in the ancient Near East. Their relationship with the land was not merely one of survival, it was a dynamic and creative interaction that enabled them to build thriving cities, establish robust trade networks, and develop a rich cultural life. The decline of their civilization may have been the result of external forces beyond their control, but their legacy lives on in the architectural ruins, technological innovations, and cultural artifacts that continue to be uncovered today. Through these remnants, we can see the lasting impact the Philistines had on the world they once inhabited, a testament to their ingenuity and resilience in the face of a constantly changing environment. The Philistine civilization, though ultimately absorbed into the greater empires of the ancient Near East, played a crucial role in shaping the historical and cultural contours of the region. The tale of the Philistines is one of contrasts, an amalgamation of foreign influences and local traditions, an identity forged between conflict and cooperation, and a people who left an indelible mark on the ancient world despite their eventual conquest. What is particularly fascinating is how their history transcends the boundaries of warfare and political rivalry, extending into the realms of cultural exchange, art, and religious practice. As we reflect on the Philistine legacy, it becomes clear that the full story of their civilization is far more complex and multidimensional than the often simplistic view conveyed by ancient texts or modern interpretations. The Philistines arrived on the eastern Mediterranean coast at a time when the region was undergoing significant transitions. The Bronze Age was fading, and the early Iron Age was beginning to take shape. The Philistines, as part of the mysterious Sea Peoples, were thought to have arrived in the Levant from the Aegean and Mediterranean regions. Their origins, once thought to be entirely foreign and invasive, are now understood to have been more fluid, with the Philistines quickly adapting to and integrating aspects of the cultures they encountered. While they brought with them certain cultural traits from their Aegean roots, such as pottery styles and architectural innovations, they were also influenced by the indigenous Canaanite and Egyptian cultures. This blend of foreign and local elements created a unique Philistine identity that was neither wholly Aegean nor fully Canaanite, but something in between, a hybrid of the Old World and the New, shaped by their geopolitical ambitions and the complex cultural dynamics of the time. The Philistine cities, such as Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Gaza, became thriving centers of culture, commerce, and politics. These cities were not just military strongholds but vital hubs of trade and cultural exchange. Situated on the fertile coastal plain, these cities had access to rich agricultural lands and the Mediterranean Sea, making them strategic locations for both defense and commerce. The Philistines were skilled merchants, and their trade network spanned across the Mediterranean, reaching as far as Egypt, Cyprus, and the Aegean. They traded valuable commodities like olive oil, grain, textiles, and pottery, which were highly sought after by neighboring peoples. The exchange of goods also facilitated the flow of ideas, and as a result, the Philistines were exposed to a wide range of cultural influences, which they incorporated into their own society. In terms of material culture, the Philistines were known for their distinctive pottery, which was a key marker of their identity. Early Philistine pottery, with its bold, geometric patterns and the distinctive bichrome style, was influenced by Aegean designs but gradually incorporated local elements from Canaanite traditions. This fusion of Aegean and Canaanite styles is a perfect reflection of the Philistines' adaptive nature. Their pottery not only served as functional everyday items but also acted as a symbol of their cultural assimilation and uniqueness. In addition to pottery, the Philistines were skilled metalworkers, particularly in the forging of iron tools and weapons. Their technological innovations in metallurgy were a significant advantage, providing them with superior weaponry and agricultural tools. The widespread use of iron, which the Philistines pioneered in the region, eventually had a lasting impact on the ancient world, as it revolutionized warfare and agriculture across the Mediterranean. While the Philistines were undoubtedly adept at technological and economic advancement, their cultural achievements were not confined solely to material production. Religion played an important role in Philistine society, and their religious practices were deeply intertwined with their identity. Central to Philistine religious life was the worship of a pantheon of gods, with Dagon being the principal deity. Dagon, the god of grain and the sea, was the Philistines' chief god, and temples dedicated to him have been uncovered in several Philistine cities. These temples were not just places of worship but were also centers of social, political, and economic life. They were places where important political decisions were made, and where leaders sought the divine favor of the gods before engaging in battle or making key decisions. Religious rituals, including sacrifices and festivals, were an essential part of public life, reinforcing social hierarchies and cementing the authority of political leaders. The Philistines were not isolated in their religious practices but were influenced by the surrounding cultures. Their pantheon included deities that were worshipped by their Canaanite neighbors, such as Baal and Asherah, who were also associated with fertility, agriculture, and warfare. The Philistine ability to incorporate elements from Canaanite religion, while maintaining their own unique religious identity, demonstrates their adaptability and pragmatism. They were able to synthesize foreign religious practices with their own traditions, forging a spiritual worldview that was deeply connected to their surroundings and needs. One of the key features of Philistine society was its military prowess, which was directly linked to their technological innovations. The Philistines are perhaps best known in biblical accounts for their ongoing conflict with the Israelites, but their military strength was not solely defined by their clashes with Israel. In fact, their military tactics, fortified cities, and advanced weaponry were crucial for their survival in a region fraught with political instability and constant threats from powerful neighboring empires, such as Egypt and later Assyria. The Philistines were one of the first peoples in the region to utilize iron extensively, and this gave them a significant advantage in battle. Iron weapons were stronger, more durable, and cheaper to produce than bronze weapons, making them more accessible to the Philistine military. Their superior weaponry, coupled with their advanced fortifications and strategic use of coastal and land-based defenses, made the Philistine cities formidable opponents. Despite their military strength, the Philistines' relationship with the Israelites was marked by conflict, as the two peoples vied for control over the Levant. The Hebrew Bible presents the Philistines as a constant threat to the Israelites, with several notable battles, including the famous encounter between David and Goliath, symbolizing the ongoing struggle for dominance. However, it is important to recognize that this portrayal of the Philistines as constant adversaries is often oversimplified. There were periods of peace and cooperation between the two groups, as evidenced by the occasional alliances formed in the face of common enemies, such as the Amalekites. The Philistine and Israelite societies were intertwined in ways that were not always defined by warfare. In fact, the Philistines, like many ancient peoples, engaged in complex political, social, and economic interactions with their neighbors, and their history was as much about cooperation as it was about conflict. As the Philistine cities grew and prospered, they found themselves increasingly caught between the geopolitical ambitions of larger empires. The rise of the Assyrian Empire in the 8th century BCE marked the beginning of the end for Philistine autonomy. The Assyrians, known for their brutal military tactics and expansionist policies, began to encroach upon Philistine territory. The Philistines, who had once held sway over their coastal cities, were forced to submit to Assyrian control. Over time, the Assyrians dismantled the Philistine cities, replacing local rulers with Assyrian governors, and incorporated the region into their empire. The once independent Philistine cities were reduced to vassal states, and their power was absorbed into the vast Assyrian imperial system. Despite the Assyrian conquest, the Philistine legacy endured. While their political power had diminished, their cultural contributions continued to resonate in the region. The use of iron, which the Philistines had pioneered, spread across the ancient Near East, including into the military forces of the Assyrians themselves. In terms of architecture, the fortified city structures developed by the Philistines were adopted by other civilizations in the region, including the Israelites, who built heavily fortified cities in the wake of Philistine influence. Even their religious practices and material culture, such as their pottery and artifacts, continued to be revered by subsequent generations. Ultimately, the Philistines' story is one of resilience, adaptability, and innovation. While their cities may have fallen and their political power waned, their cultural influence continued to shape the course of ancient history. Their ability to blend foreign influences with their own traditions allowed them to create a unique identity that was at once part of the greater Mediterranean world and yet distinct in its own right. The Philistines' contributions to metallurgy, urban planning, religion, and military technology left a lasting imprint on the civilizations that followed. Through their achievements and their interactions with the peoples around them, the Philistines played a vital role in the shaping of the ancient Near East, and their legacy is still evident in the archaeological record today. The decline of the Philistine civilization and their eventual assimilation into larger empires marked a pivotal moment in the history of the ancient Near East. Their downfall did not occur in a single catastrophic event, but rather over a protracted period of military conquest, political subjugation, and cultural integration. The Philistines, once a formidable force in the eastern Mediterranean, saw their cities fall one by one to external powers, most notably the Assyrians and later the Babylonians. Despite their eventual defeat, the legacy of the Philistines persisted in subtle ways, influencing the cultural and political landscapes of the ancient world long after their independence had been stripped away. As the Philistine cities came under increasing pressure from external powers, their political autonomy began to erode. The first major blow came from the Assyrian Empire, which, during the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III and his successors, expanded its reach into the Levant. The Assyrians were known for their brutal military tactics and their policy of total domination over conquered peoples. They used siege warfare, deportation of populations, and the destruction of cities to secure their dominance. For the Philistines, this meant the gradual dismantling of their urban centers. Cities such as Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Gaza, which had once been thriving hubs of commerce, culture, and military power, were systematically reduced to vassal states under Assyrian control. The Philistine people, who had long prided themselves on their independence and military prowess, now found themselves subjects of a foreign empire. The Assyrians did not simply conquer the Philistine cities, they sought to erase the very identity of the Philistine people. Assyrian rulers were notorious for their policy of deportation, removing large portions of the local population and resettling them in other parts of the empire. This was part of a broader strategy to break the resistance of conquered peoples by dispersing them across the empire, preventing them from organizing rebellions or re-establishing their independence. In this process, the distinct cultural identity of the Philistines was gradually absorbed into the larger Assyrian imperial system. While some Philistine communities may have survived, they were no longer the powerful, independent civilization they had once been. Despite this, the Philistine legacy did not disappear completely. The Assyrian conquest may have fragmented the Philistine population, but their cultural contributions lived on in the region. Many of the technological and architectural innovations pioneered by the Philistines, such as their advanced fortifications, the use of iron in warfare, and their distinctive pottery, continued to influence the surrounding civilizations. The Assyrians, who absorbed much of the Philistine military technology and urban planning techniques, integrated these elements into their own empire. The use of iron, for instance, which the Philistines had introduced to the region, became a standard practice in Assyrian warfare, and their military tactics, including the use of siege warfare and fortified cities, were widely adopted throughout the ancient Near East. Furthermore, the Philistines' religious practices, which blended elements of Aegean and Canaanite traditions, left a lasting imprint on the region's religious landscape. Although the Philistine pantheon was eventually overshadowed by the gods of larger empires like the Assyrians and Babylonians, elements of Philistine religious practices, such as the worship of Dagon and other local deities, continued to influence the religious rites of the people who lived in the region. In fact, the Philistine practice of incorporating foreign religious influences into their own tradition served as a model for other peoples in the region, particularly the Israelites, who themselves adopted and adapted foreign religious practices as they formed their own identity. The eventual decline of the Philistine cities was further accelerated by the rise of the Babylonian Empire. The Babylonians, under the leadership of Nebuchadnezzar II, conquered the remnants of the Assyrian Empire and expanded their control over the Levant. The Philistines, who had already been weakened by Assyrian rule, were further diminished by Babylonian conquest. While the Babylonians did not completely eradicate the Philistines as the Assyrians had attempted, they effectively ended their autonomy, incorporating them into the larger Babylonian sphere of influence. The fall of the Philistine cities to the Babylonians was the final chapter in their decline as a distinct civilization, marking the end of their political and military power in the region. However, the Philistine legacy lived on, albeit in more subtle ways. Even after their political and military defeat, the cultural and technological innovations of the Philistines continued to be passed down through subsequent generations. The pottery styles that had once characterized Philistine cities were absorbed into the broader cultural fabric of the ancient Near East. Similarly, the ironworking techniques pioneered by the Philistines spread across the region, influencing the armies and industries of neighboring peoples. While the Philistines themselves were no longer an independent people, their contributions to the ancient world were not forgotten. Moreover, the role of the Philistines in the biblical narrative ensured that their legacy remained embedded in the cultural consciousness of the region. The Bible's depiction of the Philistines as the enemies of the Israelites, especially in the famous story of David and Goliath, has ensured that their story is remembered, albeit through a lens of conflict and antagonism. This portrayal, while often one-sided, has kept the name of the Philistines alive for millennia. The Philistines, as a symbol of foreign opposition and a foil to the Israelites, continue to occupy a place in religious and historical discourse, even if the full complexity of their civilization is not always acknowledged. In modern times, the study of Philistine history has undergone a significant shift. Archaeological excavations at sites such as Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Gaza have revealed new insights into the Philistine way of life, shedding light on their cultural achievements, technological innovations, and interactions with other peoples. The Philistines are no longer seen solely through the lens of biblical rivalry, but as a distinct civilization that made significant contributions to the development of the ancient Near East. Their pottery, architecture, religious practices, and military technology have all been recognized as important aspects of their legacy. Modern scholarship has helped to reframe the Philistines, not as mere antagonists in the biblical narrative, but as a people whose story is integral to understanding the broader history of the ancient Mediterranean world. The ultimate fall of the Philistines, then, is a story of resilience, adaptation, and assimilation. Despite the overwhelming military forces that brought about their political and military downfall, the Philistine people's cultural contributions endured. Their cities may have been conquered, their autonomy lost, and their political influence diminished, but their innovations in technology, their architectural achievements, and their religious practices left a lasting legacy that influenced the civilizations that came after them. Even in their defeat, the Philistines proved to be an essential part of the historical tapestry of the ancient Near East, their influence continuing to reverberate in the cultures that succeeded them. While the political and military strength of the Philistines eventually faded, their story is far from one of mere decline. The Philistines' ability to adapt, integrate, and influence the civilizations around them is a testament to their resilience. Their complex identity, shaped by both foreign and indigenous influences, is a reflection of the broader dynamics of the ancient Mediterranean world, a world marked by constant movement, cultural exchange, and the interplay of power. The Philistines were not merely a footnote in history, they were a significant force in the shaping of the ancient Near East. Though they are often remembered as enemies in biblical texts, their cultural and technological legacy speaks to a civilization that was far more multifaceted and enduring than the simplistic images often presented in ancient narratives. The story of the Philistine civilization is not merely one of rise and fall, but of transformation and adaptation within the constantly shifting dynamics of the ancient Near East. Their interactions with neighboring civilizations, their resilience in the face of external threats, and their ability to shape and reshape their identity over centuries all contribute to the enduring fascination with this once powerful people. Though their history has often been overshadowed by biblical narratives and later imperial conquests, recent scholarship and archaeological discoveries have illuminated the rich complexity of Philistine society. As we explore the deeper layers of their culture, it becomes clear that the Philistines were far more than a transient enemy in the biblical context. They were a civilization with lasting contributions to the region's development, marked by a blend of foreign influences and indigenous innovation. One of the most intriguing aspects of Philistine history is the way their identity evolved over time. Initially, the Philistines were viewed as outsiders, foreign invaders who arrived on the shores of Canaan around the 12th century BCE as part of the mysterious Sea Peoples. Early accounts of their arrival described them as an alien force, distinct from the native Canaanite populations, with their own language, customs, and material culture. This perception of the Philistines as a separate, invasive group was largely shaped by both ancient narratives and early archaeological assumptions. Their distinctive pottery, architecture, and use of iron set them apart from their neighbors, reinforcing their image as a foreign people. However, as research progressed, it became increasingly clear that the Philistines were not just invaders, they were settlers who assimilated into the existing social, economic, and cultural fabric of the Levant. The archaeological evidence reveals that the Philistines did not remain isolated from the people they encountered. Instead, they adapted and integrated local traditions with their own Aegean heritage. The unique pottery styles, for example, initially identified as purely Aegean, were found to incorporate elements of Canaanite and Egyptian designs, suggesting that the Philistines were part of a broader cultural exchange rather than a monolithic foreign force. This synthesis of Aegean and local traditions marked the beginning of the Philistine transformation into a new, hybrid society. Over time, the Philistines began to adopt the agricultural practices of the Canaanites, incorporating crops like olives, barley, and grapes into their diet and economy. Their cities, though initially characterized by Aegean-inspired urban layouts and defensive fortifications, gradually embraced the architectural styles of their Canaanite neighbors. This blending of cultures created a distinctly Philistine identity, one that was neither fully Aegean nor entirely Levantine, but a product of both. This process of cultural integration extended beyond material culture and into the realm of religion. The Philistines brought with them their own pantheon of gods, with Dagon being the most prominent among them. However, they did not simply impose their religious practices on the people they encountered. Instead, they integrated local deities into their worship. Dagon, while central to Philistine religion, was often worshipped alongside gods from the Canaanite pantheon, such as Baal and Asherah. This syncretism, blending foreign and local religious practices, was not unique to the Philistines. It was a common phenomenon in the ancient world, where the boundaries between cultures were often porous and permeable. The Philistines' ability to incorporate aspects of Canaanite religion into their own rituals reflects their pragmatic approach to cultural exchange and their desire to forge bonds with the peoples around them. In addition to religious practices, the Philistines' military organization and technological advancements played a significant role in their rise to prominence. The Philistines are perhaps best known for their ironworking expertise, which gave them a distinct military advantage over their neighbors. While many of the peoples in the region still relied on bronze for their weapons, the Philistines were among the first to adopt iron, a material that was both stronger and more widely available. This technological innovation revolutionized the way warfare was conducted in the ancient Near East, and the Philistines' mastery of ironworking contributed significantly to their military successes. They were able to craft superior weapons, tools, and armor, which gave their armies an edge in battle. The widespread use of iron also allowed the Philistines to establish a robust military infrastructure, enabling them to maintain control over their cities and defend against external threats. The Philistine military was not only defined by their superior weaponry but also by their strategic use of fortified cities and defensive architecture. The Philistines constructed heavily fortified cities, with massive walls, watchtowers, and gateways designed to withstand sieges. This defensive architecture was crucial to their survival, as the coastal cities they inhabited were vulnerable to invasion from both the sea and land. The construction of these fortified cities was a reflection of the Philistines' understanding of the importance of military defense in an unstable and constantly shifting geopolitical environment. Their military prowess, combined with their advanced urban planning, allowed them to hold off numerous external threats over the centuries, from Egyptian incursions to attacks by neighboring peoples such as the Israelites. However, despite their military strength and technological innovations, the Philistines were not immune to the pressures of imperial conquest. The rise of the Assyrian Empire in the 8th century BCE marked the beginning of the end for Philistine independence. The Assyrians, known for their ruthless military tactics and imperial expansion, began to encroach on Philistine territory, ultimately bringing their cities under control. The Assyrians employed a variety of tactics to subjugate the Philistines, including military campaigns, siege warfare, and the deportation of populations. The fall of the Philistine cities to the Assyrians was a significant turning point in their history, as it marked the loss of their political autonomy and the beginning of their integration into the larger Assyrian Empire. Despite the military defeats and political subjugation, the Philistine cultural and technological legacy did not disappear entirely. The Assyrians, while dismantling the political structures of the Philistines, absorbed many aspects of their material culture and military innovations. The use of iron, which the Philistines had pioneered, became widespread throughout the Assyrian Empire, revolutionizing warfare across the ancient Near East. The Assyrians also adopted elements of Philistine architecture, particularly their advanced fortifications, which influenced the design of Assyrian cities and military structures. Even in their defeat, the Philistines continued to influence the development of the empires that succeeded them. In the centuries following the Assyrian conquest, the Philistines were further absorbed into the Babylonian Empire. The Babylonians, under the leadership of Nebuchadnezzar II, extended their rule over the Levant, further diminishing the already weakened Philistine presence. The Babylonian conquest of the region marked the final chapter in the history of the Philistine cities, as they were fully incorporated into the larger Babylonian imperial system. Despite this political subjugation, the Philistine cultural influence continued to echo through the region. Elements of Philistine material culture, such as their pottery, religious practices, and technological innovations, were absorbed into the broader cultural milieu of the ancient Near East. One of the most enduring aspects of Philistine culture, however, was their presence in the biblical narrative. In the Hebrew Bible, the Philistines are depicted as the archenemies of the Israelites, particularly in stories such as the famous battle between David and Goliath. The Bible portrays the Philistines as a barbaric, pagan people, and their role in the text has shaped their legacy for millennia. While this biblical portrayal has undoubtedly influenced how the Philistines are remembered in the West, it has also obscured the complexity of their civilization. The Philistines were not simply enemies of the Israelites, they were a vibrant and dynamic people, whose contributions to the ancient world were significant and multifaceted. In modern times, archaeological excavations and scholarly research have shed new light on the Philistine civilization, challenging the simplistic and one-dimensional portrayal of the Bible. Excavations at sites like Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Gaza have revealed rich material culture, including advanced urban infrastructure, distinctive pottery, and evidence of a complex social structure. These discoveries have helped to redefine the Philistines not as mere biblical antagonists, but as a people who played a crucial role in the development of the ancient Near East. Their interactions with other civilizations, their technological advancements, and their religious practices have provided invaluable insights into the cultural and historical dynamics of the region. The study of the Philistines, therefore, is a story of rediscovery. Once relegated to the role of biblical villain, the Philistines are now understood as a civilization in their own right, one that contributed to the cultural, technological, and religious development of the ancient Mediterranean world. Their story, though often obscured by history, offers a reminder of the complexity of ancient societies and the ways in which cultures adapt, evolve, and influence one another over time. Through their achievements, their interactions, and their eventual integration into larger empires, the Philistines remain a vital part of the ancient world's legacy. The Philistine civilization's legacy has been shaped by their interactions with a wide array of neighboring peoples, each of whom left their mark on the Philistines and contributed to the broader historical and cultural tapestry of the ancient Near East. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Philistine story is how they navigated the complex political landscape of the region, balancing military confrontations with diplomatic maneuvering and adapting to the shifting tides of empire. Although their history has often been reduced to the Bible's portrayal of them as perpetual enemies of Israel, the reality is far more nuanced and interconnected with the larger dynamics of the ancient Mediterranean world. Through trade, warfare, and cultural exchange, the Philistines were deeply embedded in the geopolitical and economic networks of their time, even as they maintained a distinct identity that was both foreign and local. The Philistines' arrival in the Levant, as part of the mysterious group known as the Sea Peoples, is one of the most significant events in the region's ancient history. While the origins of the Sea Peoples remain a topic of debate among scholars, it is clear that they came from the Aegean and Mediterranean regions. These maritime peoples, who are believed to have traveled by sea, likely brought with them a range of technologies, customs, and cultural practices that would shape the future of the Levant. Among these groups, the Philistines were unique in their ability to establish lasting settlements along the southern coastal plain of Canaan, which became the heart of their civilization.